So we have a situation that we have to address first, which is I'm back here at this fun angle looking up at a TV that has Tal Islick and Keith Smith, not in our normal office area space here, but we're still making it work. We're having a good time. The other thing to address, we have a special election coming up on Tuesday. It is for Assembly District 32, and it's one that has I would consider perhaps one of the most conservative or right-leaning group of candidates you can have. You have two Republicans in the race. You also have a Libertarian, and you have a Democrat who has signaled, much like other Democrats that are in the Central Valley, that they're not going to move forward with a green energy agenda that you've seen with Democrats across the rest of California. And that is, of course, with Dr. Chris Cruz-Boone. So she's our Democrat in this race. Then the two Republicans that we have in this race are Stan Ellis, who has several endorsements from just about everyone you can imagine. Holly Willoughby, who has no endorsement. She's very proud of that. She's reminded me several times over email. Then also you have Libertarian William Brown, who is in this race as well. Spoken with all four of those candidates. We have those interviews online. Just jumping into it, Tal, from what you see, 50% and you're in, and Stan Ellis is in with a lot of important people in Kern County, a lot of people that when voters are looking for who they trust in telling them this is who to vote for, he has a lot of their endorsements, whether it's Representative Dave Valdeo, Vince Fong, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and the list goes on and on. What do you make of this race so far, and what do you make of his stance and his ability to potentially get to 50%?
Yeah, for sure. I hate to break hearts so soon after Valentine's Day, but the reality is that candidates that don't have resources very rarely can be successful unless, of course, they bring to the table some sort of familiarity or background that voters in this particular district would appreciate. I don't think we see that in this particular field outside of Stan Ellis. Stan Ellis is an accomplished business person, and it sounds like a pretty active fundraiser involved in politics, all of those things. But more importantly, he's been able to pull together the resources and in a way to communicate to voters in a short period of time about who he is and his background. And for this particular district, I think importantly, his conservative credentials. So I do think there's a very strong likelihood. I know there's been a poll that was released from the campaign that showed him nearing 50% about a week ago. I'm sure there's been additional mailers and probably targeted digital ads. I don't know if there's been television as well that would get him beyond that 50% threshold. My understanding thus far is that the voting, those who've turned their ballots in, have skewed more heavily towards older voters, which I think would benefit Stan, and also Republicans. Republicans are turning out in higher numbers. Despite the fact there's two other Republicans in the race, I don't think they've even met the thresholds reporting wise for resources to run their campaign. So unless they're really working heavily on the ground with door-to-door knocking and things of that nature with an army of people, which I've not seen, I just don't see how this doesn't end up with Stan Ellis exceeding the 50% threshold and swearing into the assembly here in the coming weeks.
Well, something that's very different from what happened in the fall when we saw the Kern County Republican Party chair Ken Weir run for that seat, even with Vince Fong's endorsement. And you had a mailer, but you did not have the same amount of signage that you see now. No matter where you're driving across Kern County, you're seeing lots of signs that say Stan Ellis, conservative Republican, where you did not see that, even though it was maybe an effective mailer for the limited group that got it, where you had something that says, vote for Vince Fong for CD 20, and vote for Ken Weir for 8032. Now it seems like perhaps it's also easier with Vince Fong out of the race altogether, but much easier to make that vote happen for Stan Ellis. On the flip side of that, Professor, I want to bring you into this discussion with something interesting too, which is that as far as what we see on social media and the videos that we've seen, the other Republican candidate, Holly Willoughby, she gets much more views on her clips. Perhaps it's interest in her politics that are much different than Stan Ellis. I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if she would even describe it necessarily as more conservative as much as it is more anti-corruption based, and really speaking out against a lot of those people that have endorsed Stan Ellis. And those YouTube clips generate at least twice as many views as his do. Does that have any role nowadays? I mean, it being socially, I guess, I'm trying to figure the right word here, but socially literate and being able to spread your message online, how does that play a role in elections today and possibly an election like this?
So, this is going to be a very low information election. That unless you are specifically looking for information about this contest, or you happen to see the billboards as you're driving around, you're not going to have a lot of information because the level of advertising, the level of attention for it is very low, especially given everything else that's happening right now, especially at the national level. So point one, very low information election. Those kinds of elections tend to revert to name recognition and party designation on the ballot. And after that, you might have a little information to tell you who to vote to choose among. Lots of people, though, are getting their news from social media now. Right? We know from a variety of studies that social media is a primary source of information for people today. So having effective social media campaigns is important. But the importance of it relative to having people canvassing for you, relative to having all the signage around town that increases name recognition among just your casual person who doesn't really know that there's an election going on until they get a ballot in their mail. I don't know that it's as effective, but it is important.
Tal, for you, how important is that 50% threshold, especially if it avoids a Republican versus Republican runoff? Because I imagine that's a situation that, even if Stan Ellis would be a favorite in that situation, you probably want to avoid it if it's a case of who is more conservative, because that's been tending to be the trend over recent years where you have those R versus Rs. And it's a really fascinating contest to watch someone who is considered so-called establishment versus the person who is the outsider. Is 50% the margin he's looking to get to avoid what could be a difficult, or more difficult, I should say, opponent in Willoughby should she get to second place in this election, in this primary election?
I would say any politician and certainly any candidate worth their salt would recognize the value of not having to run again, right? Like it's that probably can't be overstated. That being said, again, I don't see any indication that any of these other candidates have sort of caught steam. You mentioned the number of views on the YouTube channel. That's something to consider. But again, on the other side of the ledger of just the resources, and I think at this point, what appears to be a pretty disciplined sprint of a campaign on the part of Stan Ellis, I hope, and it appears that he is really running through the tape. It's absolutely heartbreaking in these races when you just nearly reach 50%, because then you have to, there's no kind of getting sworn in. You're either going to win the race outright in the primary, or you're going to have to run in November, and that 50% threshold is so key. So yes, I'd say with this particular race, it does also seem like there is a moment right now where a accomplished business person like Stan Ellis, that narrative matches what we're seeing at the national level in a Republican seat, right? I'm not attaching a value to it, but this deep red Republican seat, I think the couple of months that he would avoid having to run in towards a general election if he doesn't reach that threshold will be very important in Sacramento as he establishes himself as a leader in the caucus and whatever issues he ultimately decides to champion. I would, all the more reason beyond how awful it is to have to raise money again and have to go to forums again and beg for votes again, avoiding that. But in addition to that, the opportunity to focus on business issues and seeking to find waste in government. And a lot of the narrative you're hearing nationally, I think an accomplished businessman like Stan will fit in well as that conversation begins to roll out across the country and across California.
And Professor Smith, I know you talk about how important it is to reach those voters if you can, because it is a low information voter election in that, there's going to be a lot of people that it's not something that's top of mind for them. That said, nowadays, of course, everyone gets the mail-in ballots. Everyone gets that back home. How important are those methods of turning it in, whether it's through the mail, in person, or doing the Dropbox options, and of course, Dropbox and mailbox options?
Right. So the main thing is to vote. I'm always going to say that you should vote. If you've got the ballot, if you have the right to vote, you should exercise the right to vote. Even in a contest where the results are, the final outcome isn't much in doubt, whether it happens in this first primary election or the second one in a runoff, it's still important to cast your ballot, make your preference known. And yeah, so if you've got it and it's sitting on your kitchen table, if it's sitting in with the bills, pull it out, fill it out, return it. It's always better to return your ballot early rather than waiting until later. Or if you are going to turn it in on the day of the election, take it to a polling place and turn it in a polling place rather than put it in the mailbox, because if you put it in the mailbox, it probably won't get the postage stamp saying that it was mailed on the date and therefore won't be counted. So if you've got it, vote now, turn it in, be done with it. And yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's a good message there as far as how to vote. I think the big thing is too, when it comes to this time of year, I just remember from the special election that we had last time, it was this sort of fatigue, and it's still, I mean, it's only a few months after too. Professor, does that play any role in people like, oh, I got to go fill this thing out?
Sure.
Or is it like, hey, we got the routine, we know this is the last one that we got to have?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we talk about in political science is the fact that we have so many opportunities to vote on things here in the United States. And it does induce a kind of fatigue among voters that, oh, geez, it's another election. But, we do have the opportunity to vote on so many things. And we ought to exercise that right to vote on the things that we're given the opportunity to do so. But yeah, these are the kinds of elections where people who vote every election cycle are the ones that are going to be voting in this one. People who drop in and out of elections, maybe get excited about the presidential election and then don't vote in other elections. They're probably not going to be voting in this election. This is a habitual voter kind of election where people who do it frequently are the ones who are going to be paying attention, realize that they've got a ballot, and actually try and get that ballot submitted in time.
And then Tal's view on this question as we shift gears over to high-speed rail. This was a press conference yesterday. Sean Duffy, Transportation Secretary, new Transportation Secretary, came in and said basically we're going to have a compliance review of federal funding as it goes for the California High-Speed Rail Authority and that project. And Vince Fong was there, Congressman Fong. Also, there was Stan Ellis in the background. He was framed out of some media shots, so maybe that was a well respected of the other three candidates in the race. I'm sure that was top of mind for LA media as they were getting those shots of who was there. But that's a good joke too. But that's where we were yesterday. We were following that really interesting development, of course, because where does that train go through? It goes through Bakersfield. It goes through Shafter. It goes through the Central Valley. Allegedly, it hasn't really been built yet. What do you make of this message? Because it seems very in theme, because it really is a messaging compliance review. It seems very much in theme with what we've seen from the presidential administration as it comes to DOGE and cutting costs where they can.
Yeah, I think it's good politics for the most part for those members that were there from Republican districts. I think Assemblywoman Macedo, Assemblyman Tangapa, Congressman Fong, Congressman LaMalfa. I would assume that this is a 80-20 issue in their district as far as folks who are opposed to the project. That being said, I do wonder in this new, if we harken back to all of whatever 6 weeks ago or more, this movement from sort of assuming that all folks that work in the trades are going to vote Democrat towards many of them being supportive of President Trump and his campaign, right? I think you saw it with the Teamsters. That narrative, more of sort of a populist narrative, is beginning to make its way through the Republican Party. I always view it as sort of like unions on one side and the United States Chamber of Commerce on the other. That sort of spectrum is changing as it relates to where the party's finding itself. So I do wonder from a jobs impact, the number of people who are working on this project, does that begin to complicate the sort of like easiness of the issue as far as Republicans opposing high-speed rail? It's a boondoggle. It's tripled in budget. It's not nearly what it was once promised. All of those things, which I think are good politics, up against the fact that there are many union people that are working on this project and probably will be for the foreseeable future. So I think it's good politics today. Will it be good politics in the next 2 to 4 years and beyond for Republicans as that party changes under the leadership of President Trump? That sort of remains to be seen.
Professor, to you, as we wrap up this discussion here too, I just wanted to get this high-speed rail question into you. That's a great point that Tal was making, because when I was at the ribbon cutting ceremony that was at Shafter a month ago, and it was the day before the wildfires, the LA wildfires, that the governor was also at when we were setting up to film our live shots for that day. We had a couple of construction workers there who were walking by, who have been working on there for some time. And we asked kind of, what are your thoughts on this? And they really, really said, we're proud of this project and we can't wait to write it once it happens. So that is kind of that little bit of a divide that Tal was maybe saying about the good politics today, tomorrow. What do you make of this as we wrap up this discussion?
Well, I think Tal is exactly right. It's the kind of thing that works in a political campaign, but when it comes time to make decisions where people's lives and livelihoods are actually going to be affected, then you start to have questions, and maybe you don't want to have that vote, or you don't want to make that decision because your constituents are the ones that are going to get hurt. And I think and we're starting to see this in a number of areas with kind of the national cost-cutting DOGE thing, whereas real programs that provide real services to people are being affected, then the constituents are pushing back, and Republicans are not as interested in maybe pursuing the policies that it sounds good on the campaign trail. I was just reading a story about Congressman Valdeo and cuts to Medicaid, or potential cuts to Medicaid. And, there's a lot of people in his district that rely on that program for healthcare, and yet it's the main target for cost cutting for the Republican budget plan. And so you've got cross pressures there. And yes, we need to cut the budget, but then this is a real program that provides real benefits to constituents. It's hard to vote to cut that at the final.
Yeah, we have to get the professor out by a certain time, I believe, by 2:20.
Yeah. Thank you.
As we're going down to the wire there. That said, since the congressman's name was invoked, and Tal, you did work for some time with Congressman Valadeo, anything you'd like to say on that? I mean, my read has always been, and especially this was yesterday too, he does not seem to dip his toe into things he doesn't want to talk about. And that was something yesterday when we had reached out to him about the high-speed rail authority, maybe his thoughts, if he was going to participate in that presser and things like that. We didn't hear back.
Yeah, I believe I was even quoted in that particular story. So yeah, no, I'm pretty familiar with the issue as it relates to Congressman Valadeo. And I would compare it to if, our household, if my wife, daughter, and I were deciding we needed to sort of tighten our belts because something had happened with work and we needed to be more thoughtful about the money that was going out. It's possible, and my wife would say, "Oh my God, we're not going to be able to buy toilet paper. We're not going to be able to pay our mortgage." Like, there's lots of ways to rein in spending. The entitlement programs are the easiest sort of boogeyman for people to say, "Oh my gosh, if there's any cuts to those, it's going to have this devastating effect on people across the country." That is not untrue. However, there's lots of shades of gray within that. These are giant, multi-hundreds of billions of dollars in programs. You could make reforms. You could look at who's eligible for them. You could look at ways to add competition so that we could lower the price of some of the services or the goods that are associated with those entitlement programs. There's a lot of things that could be done. Going back to the sort of good politics theme, it's very easy just to strike fear into the hearts of those who are underserved or the elderly and say your program is going to get cut. The reality is, especially for Medicare, the likelihood that a politician of any stripe is going to reduce the benefits to the subset of voters or citizens that actually vote in relatively high numbers, I'd say is very, very unlikely, regardless of their ideology, right? So the non-discretionary spend, the entitlement programs, I don't see there may need to be, if we're going to actually attack the national debt, But there's a lot of work to be done prior to that that I think is much more politically defensible. And that's why you see the USAID stuff. It's a difficult program to, when you piece it out one program at a time, to defend. Whereas cutting Medicare, if it was actually a reduction in benefits, that's very difficult to defend politically, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of work at the national level up to the point of reforming our entitlements, which, if we're serious about chronic deficits and the debt, has to happen. Just because it's whatever 80% of our budget, right? But there's lots, that 20% is still a nice meaty multi-hundred billions of dollars or trillions that they can tackle first. And politically, they'd be crazy not to start there.
The train, I believe, is leaving the station from Professor Smith's office as well. Thank you for staying for these extra few minutes here. And thank you for also, you'll be joining us next week for our special election coverage too at 10, 11 o'clock. So we thank you for that. And I'm sure we'll be talking with Tal in the coming days after that too. So thank you both so much for your time ahead of this weekend and for putting up with this lone empty office. And have a good rest. Yeah, absolutely. Have a good rest of the weekend.
You too. Thanks for reaching out.
Thanks, Keith.
Bye.